they're time limited. And I know the comments we're going to get. Hi, everybody. I can anticipate what you're going to say. We're not saying Russia is going to collapse economically, but we're saying that Russia has got constraints, serious constraints on the invasion. The quick caveat here is the Institute for Study of War updated this week on how much territory Russia has taken this year in Ukraine. It's less than 1%. It's 0.9 of 1% at a cost of 400,000 casualties.
Hello and welcome to Frontline Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott is also Editor-in-Chief of EA Worldview and a regular commentator on the war in Ukraine. Scott, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Hey, it's great to see you. It's been a crazy week. Let's see if we can sort it all out in 30 minutes.
Exactly. So we are talking at 3 p.m. London time on Thursday, the 11th of December. Important to give the time and the date because things are moving so fast when we talk about the talks to try and bring an end to the fighting in Ukraine. There's been a flurry of phone calls, emotive rhetoric over ending the war. And President Zelensky's under this immense pressure now by the US administration to agree a deal. There doesn't look like anything yet that's going to achieve a just peace. What is the least bad option for Zelensky?
I think, Kate, to answer that question, it's good. We need to establish where we are with two competing proposals. And we need to preface this, by the way, that for all those people that are talking about a peace plan, peace around the corner, the fundamental here is that the one person that could bring about peace, or at least a movement towards it, is Vladimir Putin. And that until Putin accepts a ceasefire, we are going to be in this position where you and I are going to be talking about week in, week out, on this, about where are we with the competing proposals? Because the first proposal, just a quick reminder, is the one that has a lot of the Russian talking points since the spring, and that was developed by the Kremlin with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoys, at the end of October. Now, there are multiple problems with that proposal, even though a certain Trump faction, not the entire Trump administration, but a certain Trump faction is trying to push Zelensky to agree it. That is the demand that Ukraine surrender the rest of the Donetsk region, the strategic region in the east of the country, to Russia. That's a non-starter. The demand that Ukraine is permanently banned from NATO, that's a non-starter. The sharp limitations, not only on Ukraine's troop levels, but on Western assistance to Ukraine, that's a non-starter. U.S. getting 50% of the profits from Ukraine's recovery fund, non-starter. And then other problematic elements, such as not only does Russia get the sanctions lifted on it, but there's an amnesty for their war crimes. And when Vladimir Putin is wanted by the International Criminal Court over the deportations of Ukrainian children, that's an issue. That's why the Europeans, going back to the start of November, and importantly, with the support behind the scenes of Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, they issue a counterproposal. And the counterproposal, and this is why I mentioned Putin at the start, it begins with the ceasefire. So look, you ceasefire, then we'll talk. We'll talk about the territory. We'll talk military, economic, political arrangements. Beyond that, the counterproposal says, look, we don't ban Ukraine joining NATO, although that is not envisaged in the near future. Western assistance continues for reliable security guarantees for Ukraine, because you do not want another Russian invasion. Ukraine's recovery funds are for Ukraine, and Russia will have to pass benchmarks. They'll have to comply with conditions if they want to get the sanctions lifted, and there is no guaranteed amnesty all the way up to the top. No blanket amnesty. So you can see the difference between the two proposals. Now, what has happened in the past week, sorry, I'll be very quick here, is that certain American officials are trying to bounce Zelensky into accepting the demands, and Europe has been giving Zelensky visible support. The meeting in London on Monday, in Brussels on Monday night, calls with other European leaders, the coalition of the willing meeting today to say, we are still with you. And we are still with you means we are still going to back your essential conditions for your security and not force you to capitulate.
You say all of that, but Do you feel we are coming to a point now, a really decisive moment? Because if you take into account the US national security strategy that was published this week, in which European leaders are portrayed as the problem and getting in the way of any agreement on peace, and where they're being described and European nations as being in some kind of civilizational decay, and where Russia relations are wanting to be normalized by the US, that actually we are seeing, and actually where Donald Trump has actually doubled down on his views in an interview that he gave with Politico, it does feel like we're moving to a point that a peace is likely to be forced upon, or tried to be forced upon, Ukraine that it doesn't want.
I think it's a decisive point, but not in the way that you mentioned. I think it's bigger than that. Because I think, I use this phrase marathon, not a sprint with Ukraine, and I think this is still the case. I don't see Putin halting the Russian invasion until he's able to seize the rest of Donetsk. He said that to an Indian outlet last week. I'm going to get it by negotiation, or I'm going to get it by force. I don't see Ukraine conceding Donetsk to Putin, and I don't see it conceding its sovereignty and its freedom of action. So I don't. When I say bigger, it's something beyond that. That national security strategy you mentioned, it's not just the fact that it simply is walking away from Ukrainian security. The Trump faction behind it, and I will name them. I think it's important to name them because I think that's how you're going to analyze it. But the Trump faction around the national security strategy is abandoning European security. We don't, in fact, not only do we not think we need to be there for European security, we think the threat is not Russia. They talk about strategic realignment in Russia. The threat in that national security strategy is Europe. They call for the breakup of the European Union. They call for the undermining or replacement of European governments by supporting so-called European nationalist movements. These are far-right movements. And why do they do that? They do that on the basis of, in part, profits. They want economic gain. Business, we'll do business deals everywhere. But in larger part, they do it. They say Europe is facing civilizational erasure because white European countries are going to be overrun by non-white people, migrants, refugees. Now that is the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. It's been around in Europe for quite some time, but in the United States, it was very much considered a fringe idea until the Trump era. Now what you have are people inside the White House who are adherents to the Great Replacement theory, either because they genuinely believe it or they want to use it as a pretext. And what they are doing is what Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's chief strategist, wanted to do in the first Trump term. And that is to ally the United States, which I will now say this, and I know the comments we're going to get on this, and I know what it means is the United States, which is now has a faction, which is a far-right faction in the government. They want to ally with far-right movements in Europe. They want to ally with the AfD in Germany. They want to ally with the National Rally in France. They want to put the Reform Party in power in the UK, this needs to be said, and get rid of the Labour government. They also, in an earlier draft of this document, it appears, are talking about finding those movements in Italy, Poland, Austria. So they're talking about not the NATO alliance, not the US-Europe alliance we're talking about. They're talking about an alliance of far-right or hard-right movements going forward.
That being said, though, I mean, at the moment, we don't actually know how much of this national security strategy is actually going to come to fruition, because Donald Trump is famous for changing his mind. So we really don't know whether this is going to continue beyond the current administration as yet. If I could just bring it back to the business side of things, and specifically with regard to Ukraine, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration has given its European counterparts a series of documents setting out plans for Ukraine's reconstruction and Russia's economy. And the documents reportedly include plans for US financial firms and other businesses to use around $200 billion worth of frozen Russian assets for projects in Ukraine, setting out a vision for bringing Russia's economy in from the cold. Whatever the truth is of that, it goes some way to explain Donald Trump's impatience with the war. Do you think he views it as an irritant that needs to be resolved so he can get on with the business that he wants to do?
Well, he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. Might as well restate that as well. But yes, the fundamental here is profits, because the reason why the Kremlin could maneuver the Trump administration in recent weeks is since the spring, through this very important economic advisor named Kirill Dmitriev, who's worked with the Trump people since 2017. They've been holding out the idea of U.S.-Russian joint economic projects. So in the spring and in the summer, despite the sanctions, there have been discussions of those projects. ExxonMobil was in discussions with Rosneft, the Russian energy firm. Two of Trump's donors, major donors, were in discussions with Russians over getting licenses or projects, including reviving the Nord Stream pipelines that were blown up in 2022. Those two Trump donors, one of them was a friend from university with Donald Trump Jr. And some of the discussions were with people in Putin's inner circle, Russian billionaires, sanctioned Russian billionaires. So those discussions were being held. Now, remember who revived the idea of a so-called peace plan, Trump peace plan. It was Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, and it was Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who is heavily invested, literally, in an investment management firm, which is bankrolled by Gulf states. Now, all of that means that you look to Russia and you make the calculation, which is, look, if the invasion stops on whatever term it stops, Russia comes out of the cold, as you put it, the sanctions get lifted, and there's money to be made. Let me give you a twist on the tail, though. The Ukrainians and the Europeans recognize this. And something that's almost gone past the media today was the conversation that was held last night between Vladimir Zelensky and his advisors. But now he's talking with the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and he's talking with Kushner all of a sudden. And he's talking with someone named Larry Fink, who is the head of BlackRock, major U.S. investment firm. And details haven't been given on this beyond the fact it's about reconstruction, about projects. But you can pretty much guess what here is that the Ukrainians are going back to the Americans and say, look, you want economic projects? We can work with you on economic projects, but you have to cease fire first. You've got to cease fire. So they use the economic incentive to get the diplomatic high ground back from the Russians. Now, I can't tell you whether or not that's going to work, because now the Russians will calculate. They'll try to get back in with Witkoff. They'll try to get back in with Kushner. And what happens, because of all this moving forward, you're getting leaks to the media about what the economic side of the settlement might be. So it's not just the Journal. David Ignatius, who's a longtime columnist in the Washington Post, who is very closely linked to State Department, he's got a variant on that about how much money is for Ukraine's reconstruction and who can get their hands on it.
How cleverly, how deftly do you think President Zelensky has been holding the diplomacy of all this? Because if you factor in what you've just said, and also factoring that he has offered to find a way to hold elections to counter that argument by Donald Trump that he's only allowing the war, he wants the war to keep him in position, that he's actually putting it back in his face and calling his bluff. I mean, how well do you think he's handling what is an extremely difficult situation?
Yeah, well, let me add the caveat where he's mishandled things, though, badly, which contributed in being a situation. That's the corruption issue in Ukraine. I mean, part of the remember that between August and October, before Witkoff and Kushner work with the Kremlin, you've got Ukraine and Europe getting that diplomatic high ground. Trump's even saying, look, Russia's not going to win this. Part of the problem for Zelensky is he gets engulfed by a corruption scandal, and they are dealing with it. We need to emphasize Ukraine's dealing with the corruption scandal. But when it implicates his former business partner, Timur Mendich, when it implicates his chief of staff, the very powerful Andriy Yermak, it's like it gives the Kremlin that propaganda opening. Now, having said that, yeah, I think in the last few weeks, given the fact we were at the point where there was the risk of a U.S.-Russian ultimatum being imposed on this, not only Zelensky, but the European partners have pushed back very effectively. First of all, they got Rubio in. They got Rubio in to undercut that Kremlin proposal. And I won't go into details for time as to how they did it, but it pushed it back at the start of November. Then what they did is they got back to the narrative, which is the narrative of ceasefire first. And once you cease fire, then you get security guarantees. And once you get security guarantees, yes, then you can get elections. So when Trump stomps his feet and he goes back to the line that he was doing in February, that Zelensky is illegitimate as a leader, Zelensky says, I'll hold the elections in 60 to 90 days if I have U.S. and European security guarantees. Because I think everybody wants to talk about a peace plan here. We're not talking about getting some magic settlement through skillful negotiation. We are actually talking about holding off the ultimatum and the demand to capitulate. And that's where I think what has happened, especially since Monday, has been very important.
But what's really interesting also is that demand to capitulate has got louder, and it's been articulated even by the Russian ambassador to London in the last 24 hours, saying, it's time for Ukraine to surrender. I mean, you could argue that they're becoming even more intransigent, and that, it's either we're going to gain what we want by diplomacy, or we're going to just carry on fighting.
Well, for two reasons. One is they think they have an opening. And they think they have an opening because they had gotten to Witkoff and Kushner, and because they've got Trump in his mood now. As he said yesterday, Russia is winning. And he said, Zelensky must accept he's losing. That variant of the Zelensky has no cards infamous comment from earlier this year. But the second reason why they're doing it is they're time limited. And I know the comments we're going to get. Hi, everybody. I can anticipate what you're going to say. We're not saying Russia's going to collapse economically, but we're saying that Russia has got constraints, serious constraints on the invasion. The quick caveat here is the Institute for Study of War updated this week on how much territory Russia has taken this year in Ukraine. It's less than 1%. It's 0.9 of 1% at a cost of 400,000 casualties. Russia still has not taken the town of Pokrovsk that we've been watching for 17 months in the Donetsk region. Meanwhile, you've got a flatlining Russian economy with increasing problems. I won't spell them out in detail here, but they are the combination of U.S. sanctions, which means that Russian oil revenues are now down 33% since January, and they may be down by up to 50% by the end of the year, and the Ukrainian attacks. And the latest overnight strike has knocked out an oil, a tanker, one of the oil tankers. That's the third Russian tanker hit in 2 weeks. And they've hit oil and chemical installations as well. And so the Russians are under pressure because you cannot keep running this invasion economy perpetually. So they've got a window, and the window is now. Get the surrender before next spring.
What do you think will decide which way that goes? If you say the window of opportunity is now, what will be the deciding factor?
Well, you can't predict it with Donald Trump. So you can't predict with Donald Trump but here, it's beyond Trump now. It's beyond Trump. So let's name the factions. And it is an all-out fight in the American administration. The faction that wants to see Ukraine, if not capitulate, make serious concessions, and Russia doesn't have to much, is not just Witkoff and Kushner, it's J.D. Vance. This is Vance's power play. And he's making a power play versus not only Ukraine, but also Europe, which is where the national security strategy comes in. Because Vance is the person behind the strategy, not Trump. The other side of this is Rubio. It may be Scott Bessent at Treasury for reasons we just talked about, but it's also all those career officials that you'll know well as a journalist, but don't necessarily make the headlines, who will be in the State Department, who will be in the military, who will be in the intelligence services, who will be in Treasury, who don't want to simply just give in to the Russian demands or carry water for them. And I don't know which of those U.S. factions will prevail, but I will give you one key signal to watch, Kate, which is because that faction that wanted to make sure that Ukraine was not abandoned, because they got space working with the Europeans, in the summer, you renew the U.S. weapons to Ukraine via NATO members, and you restore intelligence sharing. Now, Europe now carries almost all of the support of Ukraine economically and financially, but those military support from the U.S., that was important. If we get to a point where the U.S. again cuts off intelligence sharing and refuses to sell military weapons via NATO to Ukraine, that's a sign that the Vance faction is winning and that Ukraine now and Europe will be under increasing pressure.
Yeah, and of course, in all of this, Ukraine gets a vote and Europe will be backing Ukraine. In the last couple of days, emerging from a meeting with the French and German leaders, the British Prime Minister said this is a critical moment for Ukraine and the broader Euro-Atlantic security. How well do you think the European delegations are handling this situation at the moment?
Given that we're in the most important U.S.-European crisis since 1945, because this Trump faction does not believe in alliance. They're doing a really, really good job under the circumstances. I've read a lot of national security strategies in the past, all the way from the start of the Cold War. This one is the most shocking that's ever come out. It's not really a strategy, it's a worldview. And to be told that your countries are effectively no longer worthy of being allies with the United States, therefore that NATO is not worth anything, that the EU should be broken apart, and you then have to make a response while protecting Ukraine and respond to that as well. So on Monday, I think they carefully, they showed support for Zelensky in London, which was essential. They did not try to embarrass Trump, which is important. And you're talking about, Keir Starmer's statement, which is it's an important moment, but without calling it out. But then you get Friedrich Merz, who says it may be time for Europe to talk about being self-sufficient at this point, right? And then you get Emmanuel Macron that has a stinger of a comment. And I love this. Trump always says Zelensky has no cards. And Macron says, we have cards. And he talks about Russia's economy, but he's also making a statement broadly, which is we have cards as Europeans. We're not just simply a vassal state to the United States. We're not simply going to beg you for what happens. And then we've had the subsequent meetings all the way up to the meeting, which has just involved Friedrich Merz and Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General. What is going to be essential looking forward, Kate, is two things, especially if the Americans go walkabout. First is that the defense production scheme that Ursula von der Leyen put out, that's a 5-year program, that begins to be implemented. But secondly, the immediate challenge for the EU, it seems mundane, but it's important, is you have to finance Ukraine's government for the next 2 years because all of Ukraine's taxes go to its military. How do you finance it? And there's a battle within the EU about whether you borrow on capital markets or you get a reparations loan. And Belgium's the sticking point here, because they hold most of the frozen Russian assets that are the basis for the loan.
And there could even be movement on that between us speaking and this actually going out, because we're told it is imminent, a decision on that.
And exactly, and that's a signal. I think they meet next week actually at leaders level, and they're hoping to have everything in place to be signed. My hope was they might not agree it now, but they would agree it in January. Look, if they can agree it now, what it shows you is having faced another crisis in terms of European support, because they face problems not just with Trump, but they face problems with Orban in Hungary. They face problems with Fico in Slovakia. Now they face problems with Belgium, that they have overcome this. They have found a way around this. And if they can do that, giving Ukraine that financial security, that they just keep the public services going, that they continue to provide some element of protection on a day-to-day basis, that's vital. And then we move to, again, not just simply the military situation, but that question of energy infrastructure. Can you protect Ukraine's energy infrastructure to get it through the winter?
So let's just talk about what Mark Rutte has been saying in all of this, the NATO chief. And he was speaking at a security conference in Berlin, in which he warned of a war on the scale of our grandparents and great-grandparents, what they endured, and warning that member states are Russia's next target. How likely do you think a wider war in Europe is at the moment? And do you subscribe to what he's saying?
Not in the sense that there's a direct war. This is what we've got to play out. And what Rutte's doing, and again, tactically what he's doing is he's praising Trump on the one hand, but while saying, look, this is a critical moment. The Russian approach is that you take on Europe by trying to undermine it in multiple levels. And one level we know about, which is, you fly the drones or the fighter jets into their airspace and rattle them that way. You try to close airports with drone overflights, for example. Another level is cyber attacks. Another level is the maritime attacks. That so-called shadow fleet not only moves sanctioned Russian oil around, but they threaten to cut cables.
There's also the political angle, isn't there? The favouring of nationalist or populist groups like the National Rally in France and the AfD in Germany.
Yeah, let's take this back to, and I know the Trumpists are going to love this. Let's talk this back to Ukraine is part of a wider Russian project that took place. And it took place, paradoxically, when they lost control of Ukraine in 2014, when President Yanukovych, pro-Russian leader, when he fled, and it was not a U.S.-supported coup, get that out of your heads, those people that put that, when it was a popular revolution that pushed him out of power, Russia got the jitters, and they decided to hit back. And we know that they seized Crimea immediately, and they then tried to split Ukraine by supporting the separatists in the east. But remember what they also did over the next few years. They revamped their so-called information, in other words, their propaganda strategy, and they revamped their subversion. And they put the two together. And they intervene in the 2016 election. And they do it with the knowledge and at times collaboration, not conspiracy, that's a criminal term, but the collaboration of the Trump campaign. They did that. But remember, Kate, they also tried to get in and subvert the French elections that year, or 2017, sorry, the Macron election. They tried to subvert the German elections, which was a Chancellor Merkel's election. They were trying to break apart Western electoral systems, even at that point. Now, here we are 8-9 years later, and they're still trying to do the same thing. Now, we know about the election subversion, especially in Western Europe. So what do they do now is you try to promote, the far right movements like AfD, like National Rally, again, Orban in Hungary. But Kate, let's bring this all back around. Why is this such a dangerous moment? Beyond the cyber attacks, beyond the sabotage and so on, because you now have a convergence where there is a Trump faction and the Kremlin who have met in the middle to support those far-right movements.
I'm just wondering, Scott, to finish, if you could cast your kind of thoughts to the future, how do you think future historians are going to assess this moment in history?
I don't know, because the story isn't written yet. It's like, I've actually got a manuscript that I'm actually pitching to people, hoping someone will pick it up right now, which is on Trump in America, which covers the first term that ends in 2021. But I realize that even that history is sort of is inflected differently by where we are 4 years later. And I don't know where we wind up. So instead of saying where we wind up, let me tell you, as it were, where we are now and why it is so important. And I'm just going to say this. We get a lot of noise, you and I and others who are out there trying to cover this each day. And some of it's well-intentioned, a lot of it is not. I just came off air with a Ukrainian television channel. It's one of the startups. Now, a great interview, 40-minute interview. They're going through power cuts right now of 12 to 16 hours, right, because of the Russian attacks. They are facing the fact that they or their families could get killed on a daily basis because those missiles and drones are hitting civilian areas. They are facing all the disinformation and the propaganda that says they're not worthy to exist as a country, that their government is illegitimate, that they simply are stealing money. And we talked about those serious issues, some of which cut across our interview we just had. And you know what wound up doing? And then we talked about Christmas, because they talked about what Christmas is going to be like for us in Ireland. And it's pretty spectacular here. The Irish really go overboard on Christmas. And then we talked about what it was like in Ukraine. And then we said, we'll see each other soon, hopefully in one of the other countries. And it was a very human moment, Kate, which is these people are fighting. They just want to live. They want to have their families. They want to have their homes. They want to have their careers. They do want peace, but they don't want the type of peace that the Kremlin or Donald Trump talks about. They want it being a country which got its independence back in 1991, which has had a lot of challenges. We talked about the corruption. We talked about the political infighting. They've had a lot of challenges. They want to decide their future. And I think the question of where historians are going to be on this is, did we allow them and support them in making their decision? If history can write that we did, that in terms of security, day-to-day living, that we supported these people as they try to live their lives, we come out on the right side of history. If, however, history writes that they became pawns or afterthoughts or expendable for the sake of others, history is written by the victors, unfortunately. But a proper history would say we deserve every black mark we do if we abandon those people who just want to celebrate Christmas like I want to.
So important to end on the human part of all of this, because we can get so involved in all the politics of it. Thank you so much, Scott. It's been great speaking to you.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.